table.
So our final film that we're going to review is David Fairhead's documentary Armstrong.
Did I have anything to do with Neil being the first man on the moon? Yes, I did it.
The media labeled my father as a recluse.
Thank God social media didn't exist back then.
There were things that he just couldn't say no to.
So you want to talk about this, Annie?
Oh, yes, please. So David Fairhead, you know it's going to be good when I hand the mic. David Fairhead is known for documentaries such as Spitfire and Mission Control.
Known for?
That's what it says on IMDb. So it's very much a type director, I think. So this is a film I was sort of surprised that we watched. It's a biopic about Armstrong, surprisingly. And like Amanda said, there's been a lot of films coming from the Apollo 11 for the celebration of the 50th anniversary of NASA faking the moon landings, including Apollo 11 and First Man. And this is, but this one is, it's a very unproblematically portrayed character documentary of a man who is a known hero. It's very uncritical of him and of the whole program that he was in. It's making him the best man ever to do anything kind of person. And it's not a great documentary. So I am surprised that it has made its way into cinemas, and when I checked, I think it's only in few cinemas at the moment in Glasgow and somewhere else maybe. So that's good. But it's so uncritical about things. I find documentaries that don't say anything, that just kind of glorify the subject, to be really pointless. And this is a case in point as well. It's the whole story is so ingrained with the Western culture and media, and so well known. It's so overtold. There's nothing new I think you can dig out of this character unless you actually go a bit under the skin. And this documentary really does not do that. It's just interviewing his friends, to be honest, it does interview the wife, and the wife has a few things to say against him, which is good. But like it's still kind of, the filmmaker just picks mostly the positive points of like how good of a father he was, and then towards the end it's just like, well, he was never around, but but all the others are just like, all these friends are just like, oh my God, it couldn't have been anyone else but Armstrong. It was really, really boring, and it was really bad filmmaking. It was not cinematic. It used some archive footage, but I haven't seen Apollo 1, but I think Apollo 1 is much more interesting already than this documentary is, with NASA digging out some studio footage from their back lockers. And it repeats the same old story of a hero of America. And there was some points where it was speaking about the Russian version, like, Russia made it first with the Yuri Gagarin, and that's the story that I'm not sure if that's told, but that would be way more interesting than watching over and over again the same story of America making it first to the moon, and the words of this is a small step for a man and big step for mankind. Everybody, babies know where that's from. Like, this is not a film that needed to be made.
So I have a couple of issues with this film. Some of it is the stuff that it actually chooses to cover. The other part of it is the filmmaking. The filmmaking one is a little bit easier to pick out, right? Because it's not the most exciting film in terms of what it chooses to do. It's all very much talking heads, a bit of archive footage, and then there are these kind of like weird dramatized shots where kind of like, they'll slowly pan in over a coffee table, which has 2 copies of the same magazine for some reason. But let's gloss over that bit. But it's done a few things in really weird ways, right? So the archive footage, by nature of it being archive footage, is pretty much 4:3 ratio, right? It's quite square looking, as you know, because it was meant for TV broadcast. Then it's got interview segments, some of which are in like almost anamorphic widescreen, like a really wide. Some of them are in just kind of like standard 16:9 widescreen, and then all of these dramatized things are super widescreen. So it's constantly chopping and changing between different aspect ratios, which is kind of, I mean, really, it's kind of filmmaking 101 about how to pull your audience out of it, is to be switching between this stuff constantly. So there's that aspect of it. The second part of it is also what it chooses to focus on. And I have to agree with Annie that it's not very critical. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't address topics where Neil Armstrong maybe doesn't come off quite as much as the all-American hero, right? It addresses the relationship with his children and his wife and a couple of other things, but that's all it does. It basically mentions them and then it very quickly moves on. There are a lot of documentaries of people who do this sort of thing. It was something that I criticised. Marley was a film that came out a few years ago. It did a very similar thing where it was basically almost kind of like, it was very hagiographical in the way it approached it. Now, this doesn't quite go to that level, but it doesn't really engage with them. It also doesn't engage with things that could actually be a little bit more interesting, right? Because you might remember when First Man came out, there was this whole big hoo-ha from right-wing conservatives in the States about it not showing the scene where he puts the flag on the moon. And there's actually a very brief segment here where Harrison Ford, who is narrating this, which I think this is basically why it's got a release, right? Because Harrison Ford's narrating it. It goes through a section, he's narrating Neil Armstrong's words, where he goes into, there was a bit of discussion about what the flag should be, and basically the people themselves involved didn't really have particularly strong feelings on it as to whether it should be an American one or a UN flag or something like that. Now, given the context in which this came out, I feel like it could have done more with that, but it doesn't. It goes for this just very standard, if I'm being very critical, say made for TV approach. But even then, these technical limitations I've mentioned would kind of prevent it from having that much impact. And quite a lot of the time, people say he was a straight arrow. That's something that you hear quite a lot. He was a straight arrow. Well, I hate to say it, but unless you're bringing much imagination to the filmmaking, making a documentary about a man which was a straight arrow, you end up with a pretty straight film. So it's not to say it doesn't have its moments of interest, but it's a little bit shoddily made, if I'm being honest. And I feel like it focuses on the bits that were less interesting about his life and his opinions about the Apollo 11 mission and everything that followed.
I couldn't agree more with you two, which is very not common. I think. I thought there's only a few documentary films that I dislike more, and that Supersize Me and any Ken Burns film. But this is like third on the list, and I thought that he just like phoned it in. Like, I didn't learn anything. I don't know much about Neil Armstrong, but I didn't learn anything. The song at the end made me like, I thought I was at some sort of Disney call to action, like, America is grand or
Disney
something.
call to action.
Well, when you're like, yeah, love America or something like that. And I actually kind of found him boring. And I think I would have been interested in the Buzz Aldrin story because he probably had a little bit more fun in life or something, So it really don't have anything else more to say other than agree. And I wish I had seen Apollo 11. I wish I had seen some other sort of, because there's some really amazing films. And this is an amazing story. Whether or not, you're all-American ready for One Step of Mankind or whatever, it's an impressive, amazing feat that, like, I'm not super obsessed with space, but we know quite a few people who are, and it's like, and we still don't even know if it happened.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we've kind of drawn the short straw with the space documentaries here. By all accounts, Apollo 11, which was at Sundance, and then Sundance London, is apparently excellent. So I'd say go see that. But if you want something that focuses more on Neil Armstrong as opposed to the mission itself, in some ways, I've seen both of them now, I wouldn't actually go to this documentary. I'd actually go to First Man, right? Because yes, a lot of it is dramatized, but some of the stuff that you can see, like his now deceased, I believe, since this was filmed, wife allude to, that Annie spoke about, you actually see that dramatized in the film, and you see that impact. You see the impact that the deaths of some of his colleagues in trying to develop the technology to make the mission possible, what effect that supposedly, admittedly, had on him. But it's a far more engaging film, and I think it actually, ironically, seems to end up saying more about Neil Armstrong as a person than this does. I mean, this is basically just a bunch of people sitting around saying, yeah, he was a great engineer. Well, yeah, of course he was a great engineer. He was chosen to pilot the moon mission. I mean, you don't choose people who are terrible. Like, we know this, guys. You know, it's so in that respect, it doesn't really give you much insight, which is probably the point of making the film in the first place. So if it doesn't deliver it, then I don't really see any reason to see this above any of the other things which are coming up because of the 50th anniversary stuff.
Yeah, I agree. And the funny thing about, you mentioned the Buzz Aldrin story, that would have been more interesting to see. This documentary built a lot of tension between the two characters. It was like, then there was also Mr. Buzz Aldrin, and they knew from the first moment they were not going to be friends. And then that story just never went anywhere either. It was like, well, why? Like, what was wrong with Buzz Aldrin? What happened? And that was like, they can't speak about that because, like, that wouldn't be making him into a great hero or
and
something.
Again, that is something which I think is dealt better with in First Man, because you got I forget the actor's name, but he's the guy who's in House of Cards playing Buzz Aldrin, and he does quite a good job of portraying the issues that people might have had with him, despite all his technical capability. So once again, like, there's actually a fictional film which I think is doing a better job than this documentary, which is a weird situation for it to be in, really.
Yeah, and I am a fan of space stuff. Specifically, I've like read stories about the Challenger accidents and stuff like that. So I found that kind of aspect of the film interesting, but interesting also what you said about the flag, when they were putting up the flag, as they were just engineers flying to the space and completing a mission and not really caring if there is going to be a US flag or a UN flag. They're just putting it up there. The whole thing that is worked on the behind the scenes, so that wasn't televised. So what happened, maybe this is in his film about the mission control, you know, you never know. But who made those decisions, and like what was the actual human cost? And also the way that, because it was a race against the Russians. It's like how many risks were actually taken for this to happen is much more interesting than them actually doing their job and flying up to the moon. Like how was it built, and how was this done, and like that would have been interesting to see. But I also found it funny that it said something about the quote that, he claimed to have said in a memoirs that he didn't know what he was going to say when he stepped down the ladder. And I really think that, like, I already believe in that conspiracy of it being actually filmed in a studio, but I really don't think that he did not have that already written for him by a copywriter from NASA.
In some ways, what you said about this being the TV film, it would have been perfectly fine, you know, to be a TV film. And I gathered that there's a bunch of guys who he knew who were getting older, and let's get them on tape to like recall this story, and let's get Harrison Ford to like do the narration.
Also, Harrison Ford has never sounded so bored in his life, in my opinion, in ways narrating. I mean, I realise that, you know, if he's not jazzed about something, he's not necessarily the most emotive guy, right? Yeah. But honestly, I do think he sounds pretty bored. Yeah.
No, but I mean, then as you were saying, there were these inkling things like, the race and the mission that happened before, where the guys, had died. And it sort of harkens back to that Chernobyl. There's so much tension going on, and there was so much that could have been pulled out. But it was really just letting, like I said, phoned it in, just letting these guys who knew him speak and tell their stories. And, it's a nice archive, of their story. But there's the filmmaker is not actually interrogating the story and, like, having a conversation about it, asking them more stuff about it, and also not framing the heads right. There's too much headroom in the shots.
Well, I mean, that goes back to that thing I said about like the different ratios. Like, I mean, yeah, these people are kind of like marooned off in the middle of the frame. you know, in particular, like, because it starts off with some, as I say, which are done in just kind of like normal widescreen, but then they interview some of the same people later, whereby they're then in the super widescreen, and then Armstrong's wife is framed a lot closer than everybody else, and it's just, it's one of these things. It just draws you out of the story that it's trying to tell. And I do think the later part of the film was more interesting. I think it picked up a bit. I think the stuff when they were dealing with how Neil Armstrong felt about the celebrity that followed the moon landing, what he worked at after, the fact that he was on the investigation committee for the Challenger disaster, all that stuff is quite interesting. And I think naturally, because it happened later in his life, it's then loaded into the back end of the film because it takes a very chronological approach, right? But by that point, you've already kind of switched off from it a bit. So it's already lost its audience there. It needed some inventiveness. Now, whether that came from the visuals, whether it comes from the order in which it looks at the events in Armstrong's life, or it, you know, tried to take different thematic blocks or something, I don't know. And this is why I merely moan about films on the radio rather than make them. But it's more a case of when you have access to all these people and their direct lived experiences, I don't know how you come out with less insight than a fictional film. I honestly, I don't know how that happens. I'm not saying it needs to be dramatic and uplifting. You need to learn life lessons from it. But it was more, it didn't feel like it had much insight. It felt it was people telling me stuff that had happened. It wasn't people telling me about Neil Armstrong, the man, which was the point of this. This is what's meant to set it apart from the very well-regarded Apollo 11. It's about the Apollo 11 mission. This is about Neil Armstrong. That's its difference in focus, and it doesn't get it. It doesn't nail it for me.
Well, all this talk about, you know, landing on the moon, I was just thinking about, you know, how many films have been made about space and moons and whatnot, and wanted to know what your favorite films are. I mean, I go back to the obvious. I'm not that interesting. I love Space Odyssey. You know, it's classic, and I love the computer HAL. But I also really did like High Life. I was one of the 43% that Annie said who liked the film. I think because it wasn't sort of like this spacey sort of science fiction film. It was I thought quite a beautiful film, and I also kind of was captivated by the story, and it also made me sort of feel a sense of disbelief, which is hard for me to. I still don't understand how people survive up there. You know, even watching Armstrong, I'm like, how did he make it? And you know, I wouldn't want to go up there myself. But how about you guys?
So I think, I mean, so I'm a bit of a sucker for sci-fi films, and obviously space is something which goes through a lot of sci-fi films, like 2001 being the prime example. So a lot of films I like have space as an element. I think if I was going to pick one that maybe I think a lot of people know, but it's maybe not quite in the sort of like the pop culture canon in the same way, is Silent Running, which is directed by Douglas Trumbull, who did the special effects for 2001: A Space Odyssey. And what's quite interesting about it is, first of all, it's a really good film, but it's also quite prescient in a lot of ways. It's got an environmental angle, and we're going back to, I forget when it was made, but I think it was certainly mid-70s at the latest, I think. And it's got a fantastic central performance by Bruce Dern. It's got a lot of themes which are really quite influential. The special effects, if you've seen 2001, obviously you'll have seen his work, but also it's very hard to then not see that influence elsewhere. Even things like miniature shots from Star Wars, miniature shots from sci-fi television programs and all that sort of thing. It's very hard to miss it, and you can see how influential it actually ended up being. But on top of that, it is also a really good film. So you're going to go back in time, I would say that. More recent ones, I really enjoyed Moon. Duncan Jones's first film. I would say his films have been on a kind of exponential decrease in quality since then, but that one is really good. So I would take those. You want one from earlier on and one from more recent? I'd go for those two, I think.
Yeah, I like space stuff. So the stuff I watch is something like YouTube videos, and I read about space and space travel and stuff like that. But that also stems from, like Amanda said, the kind of fear of unknown. I would never, ever, ever go to space. And I'm like fascinated about these shuttle crashes and stuff like that. But in terms of space films, I actually can't think of anything else but the Space Odyssey. I'm afraid of aliens. So I tend to not like any alien films. I haven't seen the Alien films either, although I know it's not really about aliens, but I just don't like aliens on my screen. But the only thing I can think about right now off my head is not a film, but a TV series called Futurama.
Oh, yeah.
And I know it's not really, we're not talking about the same thing here, but it is.
Good news, everyone.
So with Futurama, I find it funny, and I find the way that it handles the idea of future and space travel in that kind of ironic and sarcastic way to be kind of realistic. At least I hope so. So like, it's not going to be very serious in the future. It's going to be a very mundane thing to go to space, and a very mundane thing to just like live on another planet maybe. And in a way, even though it is a fictional piece and it's a comedy, it says something about the future of humankind that better than some films do, I think.